Coffee was more than a drink in World War II, it was morale in a cup. For soldiers enduring bitter winters, sleepless nights and endless marches, coffee offered warmth, alertness and, a small piece of normal life. But supply chains stretched thin, convoys were attacked and rations dwindled. When the beans ran out, soldiers and civilians alike turned to their surroundings, forcing creativity out of desperation. What emerged was a catalogue of strange substitutes and improvised brews that kept men awake, warm and comforted, even if the taste was far from the real thing. These forgotten drinks reveal not just the scarcity of wartime life, but also the determination to preserve routine and spirit under the harshest conditions. In Europe, roasted barley became the most common coffee substitute. German soldiers drank what they called muckefuck, a dark, bitter liquid made from ground, roasted barley grains boiled in water. It carried none of coffee's caffeine, but the deep roasted flavour tricked the mind into believing it was close enough. Civilians across occupied Europe relied on the same drink when Allied blockades cut off imports. It wasn't coffee, but it was hot, dark and grounding, a reminder of normalcy in a world torn apart. Perhaps the closest in flavour to real coffee came from roasted chicory root. The French had used chicory in their coffee blends long before the war, but in occupied France and Belgium it became a near-total replacement. Chicory root, when roasted and ground, produced a rich, nutty brew with a faint bitterness. American soldiers stationed in Europe often encountered chicory-based substitutes, and while they missed the caffeine, they found it one of the more palatable replacements. Chicory brews kept morale alive in towns where coffee beans hadn't been seen in years. In Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, acorns became an unlikely saviour. Collected from forests, shelled, dried and roasted, acorns were ground into a coarse powder that could be steeped like coffee. The result was a strong, earthy drink that soldiers often tolerated more than enjoyed. Still, it provided warmth and routine during freezing winters. German propaganda even promoted acorn coffee as a patriotic substitute, urging civilians to embrace it as part of the war effort. For many it was bitter medicine, but it filled the cup. Beets were, really abundant across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and when supplies ran dry, they too were turned into a form of drink. Soldiers roasted slices of beetroot until they were dark and brittle, then ground and steeped them. The result was this reddish-brown brew with a sweetness, not quite like coffee, but with enough body to resemble it. Soviet troops in particular leaned on this when forced marches left them without stimulants. It wasn't the sharp, bitter jolt of coffee, but it carried sugars and energy that helped keep them moving. One of the most desperate yet widespread substitutes came from burned bread. Civilians across bombed-out cities would collect stale or discarded bread, roast it until it was charred, and then steep it in boiling water. The result was a dark liquid, faintly reminiscent of coffee's bitterness. Soldiers on the front sometimes tried the same thing when no other ingredients were available, though the taste was, closer to ash than to beans. It wasn't enjoyed, but it was tolerated in places where no other substitute could be found. Dandelions, abundant in fields and meadows across Europe, offered another answer. The roots were dug up, cleaned, roasted, and ground into a fine powder that brewed into a dark, bitter drink. American soldiers learned about dandelion root drinks through survival training manuals, while European civilians relied on them throughout the war. Though lacking caffeine, the roasted flavour had enough similarity to make it a regular replacement. Even after the war, dandelion root coffee remained a known survival standby. In Eastern Europe, soldiers and civilians alike turned to dried peas and lentils. These legumes were roasted until brittle, then ground and steeped. The result was a drink high in body but low in flavour, often described as, bland or chalky. Yet in besieged cities like Leningrad, where famine raged, even pea-based drinks were considered a blessing. They carried protein and some caloric value, making them more than just a psychological substitute. For many, it was truly survival in a cup. In Mediterranean regions cut off from imports, dried figs were roasted and brewed into a sweet, smoky drink. Italian civilians and some German units in the south resorted to fig coffee when rations collapsed. The sugar content made the brew sticky and unusual, but it carried more energy than many other substitutes. For soldiers on long marches, it offered both hydration and quick sugars to keep muscles working. Strange though it tasted, it kept men going. When food was scarce, nothing went to waste, not even potato skins. Soldiers and civilians boiled dried potato peels to make a thin brownish drink sometimes nicknamed peel tea. While, it was far from coffee, it carried nutrients and warmth, which mattered more than taste. In prisoner-of-war camps, potato peel tea was a common ration, offering a faint comfort in otherwise bleak conditions. Though weak, it was proof that even scraps could be turned into a hot drink when nothing else remained. In North Africa and parts of the Mediterranean, carob pods became a common substitute. Roasted, ground and boiled, they produced a dark drink with a subtle cocoa-like flavour. British soldiers stationed in the region sometimes encountered carob coffee when interacting with local civilians. While not widely loved, it was among the more tolerable alternatives compared to burnt bread or acorn drinks. It was proof that wherever soldiers were sent, local plants became the foundation of improvised survival beverages. What made these strange drinks matter wasn't the flavour, it was the ritual. Brewing a dark, bitter cup, no matter how strange the ingredient, gave soldiers and civilians a moment of normality in an abnormal world. It was the act of gathering, heating water and sipping from a tin mug that brought comfort. Even when the taste was unpleasant, the warmth and routine held morale together. In that sense, these improvised drinks were as much psychological weapons as they were physical nourishment. The story of coffee substitutes in World War II reveals a deeper truth about human endurance. When supply chains collapsed and luxuries vanished, people didn't surrender comfort, they redefined it. Soldiers and civilians turned to fields, forests and scraps, reshaping ordinary plants and waste into a hot drink that could stand in for the real thing. These were not gourmet recipes, but survival practices, reminders that in war, even something as simple as a cup of coffee mattered enough to inspire invention. For today's history enthusiasts and survivalists, these substitutes highlight both the resilience and ingenuity of wartime life. They show that morale is as vital as weapons, and that survival often depends on the smallest comforts maintained under the harshest pressures. If you value these forgotten stories of survival and resilience, subscribe to In the Beginning and share this documentary with others who seek to uncover the hidden details of World War II. By remembering the strange brews that kept soldiers going, we honour not just the endurance of a generation, but the power of small comforts in the darkest hours of history.